everyone. Hopefully you're not in too much of a lunch coma, or maybe just the appropriate amount of lunch coma. On your programs, this was listed as the State of the Union, but I was afraid that if I called it that, people would stand up in the middle, start heckling me, and call me a liar. You may do that anyway, but I won't prompt you to do it. Just a little light humor about the death spiral of our democracy there. So instead, I've gone with an alternate title, U.S. Online Gambling, A Brief History of the Future. Before I get into the meat of the presentation, I do want to talk a little bit about what informs my perspective, because I think whenever anyone gets up on a stage and talks to you about the future, it's necessary, it's instructive, it's useful to understand the perspective that they have, what informs that perspective. So what roles do I play in our industry? I wear a few different hats. A co-founding partner at a venture firm called Acies Investments. I was a partner at a firm called Eilers and Kraycheck Gaming and founded the sports betting practice there. And I also work as an advisor for a number of adjacent capital deployers with an interest in the gambling space, including Arctos Sports Partners. So when I talk about the future as I see it, it is informed by that mix of top-down research and consulting experience and then ground-up experience, operational experience from the early stage side, and then a hint of how folks who are near to our industry but still separate from our industry view the world and think about participation. You look familiar. Haven't we done this before? We did this last year. I think that we were on the other side of this cavernous meeting space. Now we're on this side. I like the view from here just fine. Before I jump into my new predictions, I think it's good to hold myself accountable, flip through what we talked about last year, and see what the batting average looks like. So I want to spend just a couple minutes checking in on last year's prognostications. The first one was that a disproportionate amount of the current gambling startup ecosystem will fail, and the strongest of that remaining group will benefit from that realignment. I think we can get a green check mark on that one. If you're out there raising money right now, if you're connected to a company that's raising money, this is an incredibly tough environment. And the only folks that it isn't incredibly tough for are that top 2, 3, 4% of folks who are out there right now looking for capital. The second prediction from last year was that online casino bills will move slowly and in fewer states versus sports betting thanks to a deeply entrenched status quo. Again, I think a big green check mark on that one, and I'm happy to re-up that prediction for this year. Online casino, as I think you heard on the last panel, remains incredibly and uniquely challenging to get done. And the reality is we could be having this conversation 2, 5, maybe even 7 years in the future and still looking at a map that is largely similar to the one that we're looking at today. Third prediction from last year, the sports books with the heaviest mix of profitability promises and weak product are going to surrender material market share. Feeling okay about my average so far because I think we've earned a green check mark on that prediction. We have seen share continue to consolidate in the top 1 specifically, and then more broadly in the top 2 and 3 sports books in the U.S. Folks that have pulled back on promotions have typically, not always, but typically surrendered share. And that's been especially true for the folks who have the twin problems of a product that is not resonating with consumers and an absence of marketing and promotions to paper over that weakness. And then the final prediction from last year was that we should expect the unexpected in terms of size, scale, fit, and direction when it comes to online gambling, M&A in the next 2 years. I cheated a little bit with this one now that I read it. It's a funny thing to make a prediction about the next year and then allow it to span 2 years. So that was clever of me, and it's why I get a yellow question mark as opposed to a red X on this one. We have not yet seen that wave of M&A materialize, but I still think the conditions that I talked about last year, awkward and uneven access to capital, but the need to continue to generate substantial growth, I still think those conditions mean that we are ripe for M&A that would not have been the standard or expected M&A a couple of years ago. Okay, that was the old future, man. What about the new future? Let's get into some of the things that I'm thinking about, and not just the things I'm thinking about, but the things that I am reflecting, that I am hearing, the people that I interact with, the stakeholders that I interact as they talk about their plans, their expectations for the next year. In a single word, 2023 will be all about, this is where I can insert a dramatic pause, and I can stall for time if I'm running short. I'm never running short. If anyone knows me, that is obviously not an issue when I start using words. The single word that I want to use here, that I want to emphasize, and that you're going to hear me hammer on for the remainder of our time together, is product. More than any other word, theme, topic, trend that I can think of, the single concept of product is going to inform the majority so much of what we think about, what we hear about, what we see in the industry in 2023. I want to drop into a couple of sub-themes. It's one thing to say product. That's a big word. Literally, it's a big word. It's the biggest word on the slide, intentionally. It's also a big word conceptually. It encompasses a lot of territory. So let's break it down to a couple of sub-themes and hopefully make that big general word a little more specific, a little more useful. View one, when I'm thinking about product in 2023, it's that sports betting is going to expand to new sports, new markets, and deeper risk. It's one of the things I think about first when I think about how product is going to inform our appreciation of what 2023 looks like. It's going to be that evolution of iterations on that core sports betting product. Emerging sports are embracing sports betting. We're even seeing sports, like my friends at Professional League Network, that are being created specifically to slot into sports books. So I think the first way we think about expansion of the current product is thinking about additional sports that can be fed into the sports betting product. Yes, the story of U.S. sports betting is still largely a story of betting on the NFL, betting on the NBA, and then we get quieter and smaller, and we're betting on the MLB, and we're betting on NHL. But increasingly, we are seeing that broader fragmentation in media and audience feeding into a world where niche sports are going to have an opportunity to inform more of the betting menu for a sports book in the U.S. Both because it's an interesting route into customer acquisition and a creative and defensible customer acquisition, but also because it helps to smooth out what is a very uneven sports calendar in the U.S., not only quarter to quarter and not only week to week, but day to day within that week. Another thing that I'm seeing directly, and I suspect many of you in this room are seeing as well, is that we're moving out of phase one of U.S. sportsbook. Phase one was really about minimal viable product. Can we withstand scale? Does the product fall over? Now we're moving into a phase where I'm increasingly seeing tier one and tier two operators being willing to talk about those third-party integrations that help to bring a diversity and a richness to product. And I think that openness is going to create a bit of a virtuous cycle where you're going to see more third-party suppliers be willing to innovate because they're not going to be as intimidated by the perceived sales cycle or the difficulty of securing those integrations. And then finally, and this is a little more nuanced and a little more speculative, but I do think you are going to see more sports books that think about absorbing additional risk, providing customers with products that are higher volatility, riskier from a sports book perspective, not as safe from a margin perspective. I think you are going to start to see more sports books think about offering that product set as a way to differentiate, as a way to tell a different story to consumers about why they are different than sportsbook X, Y, or Z. The second view that I want to offer is one that some of you, if not many of you in this room, have heard me offer before. We, in 2023, are going to see continued casinofication of the online sportsbook product. So my first view is that we're going to continue to see iteration on and expansion of the more familiar, the more traditional OSB product. My second view is that we're going to see that OSB product morph into something that more closely resembles in some ways a lottery ticket or a traditional casino product versus what we might think of as a traditional sportsbook product. First reason is because consumers just like this stuff. Same game parlays are not being forced on anyone. This is a product that has a groundswell of popular support and demand despite the substantial margins. Consumers are telling operators that bet a little, win a lot products are something that they are interested in and something where they are willing to absorb substantial rake to play. It's not surprising. The U.S. consumer is already well conditioned to do this with lottery tickets. And that same product that consumers are demanding has also proven quite popular with operators. They have no problems offering it, integrating it, iterating on it, and critically, has proven really compelling to investors and analysts. It is a bedrock of the story of how a lot of operators get to profitability. So you take that mix of consumers like it, operators are capable of executing upon it, and investors and analysts are clamoring for more of it. That feels like a number of vectors that are going to drive us more in the direction of an increasing amount of these kinds of products. It's also a question of necessity. I said the online casino is going to move slower than slow. I feel like I'll be making the same prediction for the foreseeable future. And the reality is, if you can't get online casino in your DraftKings or your FanDuel, you're going to get online casino. You need to get online casino one way or the other. And if a state isn't going to allow you to go through the front door, you are going to find a different way to get a very similar product to consumers. And there are innumerable ways to take a sports bet and to twist it and to reshape it and to present it back to a consumer and for that to feel a lot more like a traditional casino experience. The good news is this is also really well-trodden ground. We have a proud, long-standing tradition here in America of making things that are decidedly not slot machines into slot machines. So this is not terra incognita. We've done it with bingo. We've done it with horse races. Doing it with sports as an underlying RNG is in many ways child's play compared to those challenges. View 3. Talk about product. The first view is the traditional sportsbook product. We're going to see that expand and iterate. The second view is we're going to see it evolve in the direction of becoming more like a casino product. But this is thinking about product in a different way. It's thinking about the portfolio of products that sportsbooks offer. And my third view is that you are going to see more sportsbook operators think about emulating FanDuel's multi-vertical, multi-product portfolio. So with FanDuel, that encompasses sportsbook, casino, fantasy, racing, skill-based, and poker. Right? The most expansive portfolio, at least from a pure number of products perspective, that you see in the industry. And that story has been successful for them. I think it's been practically successful. I think it's one of, although not the primary driver of their market-leading position. But I think it's also been very successful from a narrative perspective. I think the story is an easy one for investors and analysts to grasp, and I think the appeal of that narrative alone is going to drive more of their competitors into mirroring that strategy. The reality is too, again, it's a question of necessity. What other options do you really have? If you're an OSB operator and you're finding that being quite crowded and quite expensive, and if you agree with my thoughts around the likely pace of online casino expansion, there are not many other ways to go except into adjacent products. The good news is that many of the adjacent products that we're talking about, so here we're talking about things like fantasy, we're talking about things like skill-based, we're talking about things like sweepstakes. Increasingly, and maybe this is a little more for next year, if iGaming Next is kind enough to have me back, I do think that we are going to see gambling companies think a lot more about becoming gaming companies as a natural way to expand TAM and limit some of the regulatory risk that they currently operate under. But the immediate adjacent products like sweeps, like skill, like fantasy are not terrifically difficult to develop or deploy or to operate. So you take that mix of the leader in the market is telling the story successfully. We don't have a lot of other obvious opportunities for growth or expansion. And these adjacent opportunities don't feel like we have to surmount Everest in order to execute. And I think that makes a pretty strong case for operators not named FanDuel to continue to think more and more seriously about expanding the suite of products that they offer. Fourth and final view, gambling adjacent products, which add that one to the list of funny euphemisms and nomenclature that we end up employing in this industry. Although I argue that the casino industry started it by calling it gaming instead of gambling in the first place, so they're now just kind of getting fed back what they originally served. You are going to see those products enjoy rapid growth, and importantly, you're going to see them attract funding to continue to propel and sustain that growth. Skill-based casual games are continuing to unlock new audiences that might not think of themselves as gamblers. And they're also unlocking new TAM. It is important to note that a lot of the thesis around skill-based gaming is not necessarily centered on these companies being sustainable just on winning the US. India is a market that a lot of people talk about when they talk about an Avia or a Winzo, etc. But with that said, still feels like new TAM, still feels like accretive audiences, and proven at enough scale in the US that it is capturing the imagination of investors. Real money fantasy sports, increasingly a topic with some controversy attached to it in the gambling industry. Regardless of that controversy, continues to iterate and grow. This is important to underline. I think a lot of people would have expected that post-PASPA, daily fantasy sports in general, would have gone neutral to negative in terms of growth. The reality is that salary cap on its own has grown substantially since the repeal of PASPA, and then that next generation of fantasy games is piling an impressive amount of additional growth on top of salary cap. And so we are seeing a world in which, if anything, online sports betting turns out not to be a product that fantasy competes directly with, but rather it is a rising tide that lifts a lot of different boats. Any boat that has a real money sports component seems to be benefiting, not suffering, because of the introduction and the spread of online sports betting. And then finally, this is my closing thought, in a lot of ways, sweepstakes gaming, I think, is going to be the defining product of 2023. That's thanks to explosive TAM growth. Work from Eilers and Kraychak puts the gross sales for sweepstakes gaming in the US at about $3.5 billion last year, on trend to about $7-ish billion by 2027. You've also got a wave of new brands. If anyone is watching this space, you've seen about a half dozen credible new brands enter sweepstakes gaming over just the last couple of quarters. And I think you have a lot more in the pipe. And then critically, as I spend time in venture that is adjacent to our industry but not of it, I can tell you that sweepstakes is one of the themes that checks a lot of boxes. Doesn't have the same regulatory overhang, has substantial growth, feels more like gaming than gambling, and offers an opportunity for funds that are not necessarily interested in worrying about licensure at certain thresholds, in worrying about getting into customer acquisition wars with DraftKings and FanDuel, et cetera, but who like the underlying thesis. Sweeps is the natural avenue in for those funds. And that creates almost a replication of what we saw with daily fantasy sports 6 or 7 years ago. It's a very similar set of ingredients, and I think we all know how that story worked out. Oh, there's one more bullet. What a pleasant surprise. How will the gambling industry respond? This is going to be one of the most important questions around the topic of sweeps. Historically, co-opting these products has been better than trying to compete with them. Again, fantasy sports, I think, is really instructive here. Unfortunately, that is not a lesson that the gambling industry, the commercial gambling industry, seems to have internalized at any deep sort of level. So I do think we are primed for a little bit of conflict on that front. I want to close by thanking our track sponsor, Morgan Stanley, And I also want to close by thanking you for taking your time to listen to me. Number of things you could have been doing: talking to each other, eating little sandwiches that have been compressed into aesthetically pleasing rolls, or just wandering around one of the greatest cities on earth. And I do appreciate that instead of doing any of those things, you spent 20 minutes of your valuable life with me. So thank you. These slides will be made available publicly to attendees. And as always, my contact information is right there on the screen. Happy to follow up on these or any other topics with any of you at your convenience. Thanks again.